While painting the Oathmark Heavy Orc Infantry up, I felt they lacked a little something, and looking back at the regular infantry, it was easy to see. Hoods, mantles, chainmail or fur over the shoulders. So today I'm going to show you the sculpting I'm doing on some of them. Hello everybody, welcome back to the Ash and Stone channel. My name is Chris. The putty I'll be using today is Procreate. It's a good general purpose sculpting putty. It's very similar to the more common green stuff, it's just less sticky. I've got a collection of sculpting tools, but the three that I use for almost everything are a knife, a needle tool, and a spoon and blade tool. Do they have official names? No idea, but those ones work for me. I'm going to start the first hood or mantle with a blob of putty, mixed up roughly 50-50. How much you'll need really just comes down to guesswork and experience. I'm doing a few models at once, so doing too much isn't such an issue. I work the putty into a sausage before flattening it out. I don't do this on the first one, but if you curve the putty into a bit of a crescent rather than having it straight, it does make things easier. It's also a cooler day here, so until things heat up, the putty is quite hard and it doesn't want to stick to the plastic. So with those excuses out of the way, let's get to it. I press the putty over the figure's shoulder blades and wrap it over its shoulders before grabbing the spoon tool, which I use to lightly press and burnish the putty into place. Being cooler, it does take a little bit more to get it to adhere nicely. I wrap the ends of the putty around its chest on the front, pressing them together to get the putty to join. I deliberately leave them at different lengths, because I want the finished item to be tattered and makeshift, so having the ends joined unevenly is going to aid that heaps. Once again, I burnish it down to make sure it's well stuck. From there, I use the inside of the spoon to press the top edge of the putty down to tidy up that edge and, again, make sure it's well stuck. You'll see the tool flit away every now and then. Often that's me rubbing the tool on the outside of my nose or cheek to lubricate it. The natural oils of your skin are great for stopping the tool from sticking to the putty and allowing them to slide nicely over the putty's surface. The putty at the moment is quite thick, too thick for cloth, so I use the blade end of the tool to flatten it out and press it down the model's back and shoulders, lengthening the cloth and helping to match the shape of the plastic beneath. Once I'm happy, I'll refine the edges a little more with the back of the spoon, and with a well lubricated finger, smooth out the surface of the putty. As long as you apply a wiping pressure with your finger rather than pressing onto one spot, you shouldn't leave any fingerprints. I use the blade to mark the join in the fabric to the front, rubbing in a seam where the cloth splits, and then faff around trying to get the untidy putty around the figure's throat and neck tidied up. The needle tool ends up being my best friend here, able to get into the tight gaps around the figure's head to scrape the putty into place. When I'm happy with that, I use the spoon to burnish some folds in the cloth. I start with a light pressure to rough things in to begin with, and when I'm happy with the layout, I can deepen things as needs be. The radius on my spoon tool changes from the base to the tip, so for broad, wide folds, I keep the tool flat, closer to parallel with the putty, but as the fold tapers out, I raise the tool and use it almost perpendicular to the surface, which will make the fold sharper, finer and more acute. A great reference for where to put the folds is just to look at one of your other miniatures and copy what you see. The cloth here is fairly flat and stretched out, but on other miniatures where it's bunched up, I like to use the needle tool to press in the folds, such as over the shoulders of this one. I can be much more aggressive here than on the flat surfaces, as with the cloth bunched up, the folds are much more severe. Back to the first miniature, and with broad folds over the shoulder, I gather them up around the front where the ends of the cloth meet. Again, using the spoon tool almost perpendicular to the surface to make the folds smaller and sharper. With the surface of the cloth broadly done, I use the blade end of the tool to cut in a tattered hem to the edges. I cut a little notch into the edge where the cloth has been torn, and then use the flat of the blade to widen out the base of the triangle, or to move any flappy bits to look like they are being pulled down by gravity. Lost a little footage here because I was playing with the camera settings and didn't realise it limited the recording size, but all you've missed is some refining, and I make a hole in the cloth by using the needle tool to prick it in, then wiggle the tool around to widen the hole until I'm happy. Much like that. And that's the rundown on doing a cloth mantle or shawl. For other models, I'm doing a mail mantle, which follows much the same process. I lay it out just like the cloth, but stop at the point before I put in the folds. When I'm happy with the broad shape, I use the needle tool to put in the mail pattern. This is a somewhat tedious process that requires a great deal of patience and care to get it looking really good. I'm lacking that here. It's not going to be amazing, but it'll be good enough. The basic process is that you make concentric rings of dots around the head hole, alternating direction for each layer. Each time you press in the needle tool, you want to shift it back and up a little so that the putty bulges back into the previous hole and up onto the previous layer, giving you that ring look. The alternating direction turns those rings into a weave and gives you that signature mail pattern. Consistency is the key to making amazing looking mail, but as long as you're close it'll look good. You want consistent hole size, consistent amount of bulge, and consistent spacing. You can see I've got a good shake on, so I need to have a break and a bit of food. Take your time. You've got a couple of hours before the putty becomes unworkable, so there is no need to rush. Once I can no longer finish a complete circle around the head, I make back and forth layers to finish out the pattern in the loose areas. Finally, I press the needle tool into the edge of the putty, continuing the curve created by the bulge to finish off the bottom edges of the rings. This will give the bottom edge a wavy, rounded look, rather than the flat edge we started with. Not my greatest work, but certainly good enough for rough orcish mail. The last style of shoulder covering I'm looking at doing is fur, and I start this out with a blob of putty pressed onto the model's shoulders. This gets roughly pressed into place, but unlike the cloth or mail, it's left quite thick, as I'll need that thickness to give the pelt the volume I want. The temperature's gone up and you can see the putty is working a lot better now. I use the knife to cut in a number of V's along the top of the fur, and then use the blade tool to press down the area on the outside of those V's, raising the tuft of fur up. By pressing in and undercutting the tip, we blunt the tuft and raise and define that tip. With the spoon, I flatten out the top of the tuft a little. It tends to be quite rounded after the last few steps, and flattening the top gives us some sharper edges and makes the tuft less sausage-like. Using the edge of the spoon, I press in a few lines to give the tuft a bit of a hair texture, and then tussle around the tips a little to get some curve and rough shape into each of those tufts. With the first row done, I go in and repeat the process, cutting in V's between the existing tufts with the knife and teasing them out with the blade tool. And this process is repeated all the way down to the bottom of the fur. Once I get to the bottom, I cut away or press in any excess putty that's not part of a tuft, and cut in some rough lines where the fur falls over the shoulder to the front. I press these in with the edge of the spoon, then tease them out with the blade. From there, it's just a case of refining my shapes and doing a detail pass, mostly adding in a little more texture by way of cutting in lines with the blade. And there we go, some stylised fur that'll paint up nicely. Speaking of which, let's get some paint on them. The mantles give me an opportunity to add a nice splash of colour to the tops of the models, which have otherwise ended up quite dark. So I hope that has helped out. Thank you very much for watching. A huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon, it really does help out, and we will see you all next time. Cheers.